I just want to do a quick land acknowledgement. Watershed Education Network recognizes that we are on the sacred ground of the Bitterroot, Salish, and Pend d'Oreille. Today and every day, we honor the path they have always shown us for caring and for the environment for generations to come. So Watershed Education Network is a 501c3, maybe. There we go. We're a small nonprofit that started about 26 years ago. Our mission is to foster knowledge, understanding, and appreciation for the watershed health through citizen science, youth and school engagement, and outreach to communities to ensure healthy watersheds for the next generations. I feel like I missed one there. Okay, so 501c3 nonprofit. We've been in Missoula for about 26 years. Deb Fosnot, our fearless leader, she's on the Zoom right now. Hi, Deb. She started Watershed Education Network in her basement, and it has flourished into this really comprehensive kind of citizen science, kids programs, nonprofit in Missoula. Some of our programs that we really focus on and what we're focusing on, especially coming up into the new year, first and most exciting is our citizen science stream team. So I, Asa, lead the citizen science stream team with Steffi Novak here. And Brooke over there, she's our communications coordinator. That's Joe Toth. He's a volunteer. So the volunteer team comes together in the spring, summer, and fall mainly to help collect important stream data. The data that we collect is shared with the university, a lot of master's students, undergrad students, as well as agencies like Trout Unlimited and Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. If you're familiar with WEN, you know that we have been collecting data on Rattlesnake Creek for the rattlesnake dam removal. So that was all of our citizen science programs. And we collected that data, are still collecting that data, and we're sharing that with Trout Unlimited, Fish, Wildlife, and Parks. Stephanie and I actually just wrapped up a report that we were helping with Trout Unlimited. And that report will actually be available to the public. So it has all of the data that we've been collecting the last 3 years. And we're really excited to share that with everybody. So stay tuned for that. Another big thing that we really focused on, and that's how WIN got started, was our school and youth programs, K through 12. Deb was a school teacher and she decided she wanted to get more, boots on the ground in the stream. So the basis of the nonprofit was to hang out with kids and get them in the creek collecting bugs. If you're from Missoula and you grew up in Missoula, odds are you probably hung out with Watershed Education Network and you collected bugs on Grand Creek or Rattlesnake Creek or Bancroft Pond. We've been hanging out with K through 12 kids for a long time. A lot of that has paused because of COVID. So this is where we're putting a lot more energy into our citizen science program. But now that things are kind of clearing up, hopefully, we're really excited to get back into the schools and get field trips going and more kids programs. All right, Backcountry Stream Corps. That's what I'm really excited about. We launched this last summer. Steffi and I worked really hard and we got 6 high school students from Missoula Valley to join us, and we rode mountain bikes up the Rattlesnake Corridor and we did large woody debris surveys. So we rode up, parked our bikes, and got in our waders and walked up the creek. How many miles did we end up doing?
Oh, I think it was it like 50 round trip?
Yeah, so we did 2 weeks and it was a total of 50 miles of biking. And then we would count wood in the stream. So we're looking at fish habitat. So that also leads us to why we're really excited about beavers. And I'll talk about that in a minute, but we did a lot of beaver activity monitoring where we just, we came across a beaver dam or a beaver pond and we kind of made a waypoint on our GPS. And we were really stoked about it. That upper watershed and the Rattlesnake area has lots of beaver activity. If you haven't really explored kind of in the riparian area, it's fascinating. So if you know any high schoolers, we're going to be doing that again this summer. If you know any high schoolers, encourage them to visit our website and they can apply and go through the process. And it's stipend. Couple more programs that WIN rolls with is our family citizen science. So this is a pilot program and we started it once COVID really hit and we were trying to engage our volunteers in a more independent way. So we were trying to get folks and families, we still are, to go out and take their kids kind of in a scavenger hunt kind of approach and exploring our riparian areas. And we have science kits for those. So if you're interested in that, it's a really fun opportunity for families. Another program that WIN is running is the Rise Big Sky Challenge, which is resilience, innovation, sustainability for the environment. It's a partnership with Brightways Learning, and it's a funding opportunity for students to develop ideas, solutions, and to make their communities more resilient to environmental disasters. There's a really awesome page on our website that you can look at for more information. And then the Winter Speaker Series, here we are. We had our first one in January. We have 2 more after this. I'll tell you about our next presentation in a couple slides. And then our last one will be April 25th, here and on Zoom. And then the Welcome to Your Watershed, that's a new program that's been launched by our board members. I think we have a couple board members in the Zoom right now. Maybe Sydney Stewart. So WIN and the board has launched a community outreach program to inform, engage, and welcome citizens to our watershed. We're looking for sponsors. We have an awesome pamphlet over there. Brooke, if you want to wave it up, grab one. I encourage you to grab one on your way out. There's a lot of resources on there for watershed stuff and who to contact for certain things if you're living in the Missoula Valley. All right, so WIN citizen science and beavers. So why are we here today and why do we have Torrey Ritter? We have been doing our normal stream monitoring, which includes cross sections and aquatic macroinvertebrates and water quality data. And we're out there and we're really starting to see more beaver activity. And so we're really excited about it. I mean, I don't know if anybody's experienced like walking into a creek and seeing an active beaver dam and just being fascinated by the engineering. So this picture on the bottom is this last summer in the upper watershed of the Rattlesnake, below Franklin Bridge, kind of near Beast Cove Creek. And it's just a massive beaver pond. We found a lodge and the high school students were super stoked about it. I was also very excited about it. And it just kind of encouraged us to start to learn more about our beavers and why they're these ecosystem geniuses and how we can engage the public in learning more about it and potentially doing some more monitoring on our end for our citizen science. So currently, if you guys have been up the Rattlesnake Trail up to what we call the Horse Bridge, right at it's like a half a mile from the parking lot at the Rattlesnake Trail, there's a new beaver dam. And I think Torrey Ritter is going to talk about it for a minute. But that beaver dam showed up, what was it, like in September or October? And everybody was like, oh my gosh, came out of nowhere, like overnight. And so we engaged a couple volunteers to go up and take photographs. So Steffi and I set up some photo points. We have 3 photo points for folks to go out and take photos. And we have if you're interested, we can talk about it later. But you can take photos of it and then submit it through a Google form that we set up. And we just want to do it to engage folks in beavers, but also to kind of see some changes over time and what's going to happen in high runoff in the spring. Like, is that going to be blown out? And just kind of watch how it's changing over time. So all of these things have gotten us really excited about beavers. And so that's why we invited Torrey tonight to teach us all a little bit more. So before Torrey gets started, our next presentation, I'm also really excited about this one. We're going to have Rob Roberts from Trout Unlimited. He's a project manager. We've worked with him a ton with our Rattlesnake Creek monitoring. He was kind of instrumental in the lower Rattlesnake Dam removal. And now he's working with the city to work on these wilderness dams. If you haven't learned about these wilderness dams, this is your time to come to this next presentation. There's also some really cool articles. There's a new article by the Missoulian as well as Missoula Currents about this project. But it's basically the next plans and what they're kind of the decision making of the 8 lakes in the upper Rattlesnake area that have, so there's 8 lakes, 10 dams, 2 lakes have 2 dams each, and there's some decisions being made around those dams. What's going to happen next? Dams are really old. So I encourage you to stay tuned for that. That'll also be here in this room on March 28th, as well as in Zoom. All right, so I'm just going to do a quick show and tell of our website, so folks can familiarize yourself with this. So this is our website. It's new as of about 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago. It has a little bit of everything. Here's our Rise Big Sky Challenge. We have our Instagram on here, which Brooke is our Instagram queen. A little bit of everything. If you're interested in Stream Team, we have a little bit of that on there. It kind of shows, we also have our data on here, or just some of the numbers, how to join the team, some videos, what we collect. So if you're interested, please check this out. We also have some resources on here, aquatic macroinvertebrates. We have a good friend named Al, and he put this together. He works for Riparian, which is a lab in town. So if you want to learn more about your macroinvertebrates that you're seeing, you can check out this page. We have a backcountry stream core on here for high school students to apply. There's a lot going on this website, and I encourage you guys to take a look. There's that picture again. An awesome video that we put together from last year, that sort of thing. So. And there's a donate button. Awesome. Okay. I'm going to hand it off to Torrey. Okay, not yet. Any questions so far about wind stuff? Cool. Hi, Torrey.
Hi.
All right. I'm gonna. Awesome. Okay.
All right. Okay, my first presentation in front of actual people in like 2 years, so not gonna freak out. Okay, my name is Torrey Ritter. I am a non-game wildlife biologist with Fish, Wildlife and Parks based out of Missoula here. So I cover the west central part of the state, basically Bitterroot, Middle, Upper Clark Fork, and Blackfoot River drainages. And I used to work for the non-game biologist over in Bozeman and did a lot of work with beavers and got really, really interested in them. And then did my master's work following radio marked beavers around and doing these big beaver surveys. Oh. I don't need to repeat all that though, do I? It's on camera. How's that?
Good. Good. Oh, thank you.
Okay. So anyway, I did my master's research on beavers, got really interested in them, and now I do a ton of beaver stuff with my job. And so I'm a non-game biologist, which means that I'm supposed to work on everything that you don't hunt, fish, or trap. Obviously, beavers are a fur bearer, so they are trapped in Montana, but as we'll find out later in the talk, these animals have major implications for non-game species, and that's why I spend a lot of time working on them. So this presentation is going to be about a full hour because they gave me the latitude to do that, and I can't stop talking about beavers once I start. So if you do need to stretch, if you need to get up, go to the bathroom, or anything, I won't be offended. I have a bad back, so if you need to move around, do it. All right. And one more disclaimer is I am obviously very biased towards beavers. So I just want to acknowledge right off the bat that there are negative aspects of beavers. I'm going to be focusing very much on a rosy picture of them through this talk, because I believe, and I think there's substantial evidence that in the vast majority of watersheds, beavers are an overall benefit to the stream and associated fish and wildlife species. So I organize this into 3 sections. In section 1, we're going to go over the basics of beaver biology and ecology, trying to focus on aspects of their life history that are more related to the next section, which is the ecological impacts of beavers, basically how they influence streams and associated riparian and wetland ecosystems. And then finally, at the end, I figured we could look close to home here since we are talking so much about Rattlesnake Creek. And this will just be an opportunity not only to talk about that dam that showed up at the Stockbridge, but also just to show you, because beavers have these major impacts, just how much you can learn about them without actually needing to be on the ground all that much. So jumping right into the beaver basics. And the way I'm going to set this up is we're going to talk about the actual beaver, the animal itself. And then we'll talk about a group of beavers, the family unit, and that's how beavers hang out in a family unit. Then the territory that family unit defends, i.e. the beaver colony. And then we'll look at beaver colonies spread throughout a stream or drainage, and that would be the beaver population. So we're going to start small and work our way outwards. So the beaver itself is the largest native rodent in Montana. And I guess it's the largest native rodent in North America. I think the only other bigger rodent is capybara, which is not native and lives in Florida. So these things can get huge. In Montana, the biggest one that I ever caught was 65 pounds, and it was terrifying to deal with. In other states, they've gotten up over 100 pounds, especially if all they do is eat like corn. There's some that live basically out in cornfields. So they can get really, really big. And I like to think of them as probably the most semi-aquatic rodent, the semi-aquaticiest rodent of them all. They are intimately tied to water. Their entire lives are basically revolve around water. The only thing they can't do is breathe underwater. But because they spend so much time in water, they have some really cool adaptations I want to run through really quick. So they have basically like a third eyelid called a nictitating membrane. Things like dippers also have these. So it's mostly see-through so that when they're underwater, they can actually have their eyes covered up with this nictitating membrane and they can see underwater. They also have throat flaps in the back of their throat. I messed this up when I was practicing this too. They have throat flaps in the back of their throat so that they can close that off and they can actually chew sticks and hold sticks in their mouth while they're underwater without water just gushing into their system. They have very thick water-resistant fur. The only mammal that has denser fur than beavers are sea otters, which I just learned because I was in California. They have like 1 million hairs per like square inch or something crazy like that. But this is what keeps beavers warm when they're in the water in the middle of winter. They have these fossorial claws. So fossorial just refers to the type of claw it is, and it's made for digging. As much as beavers build dams and lodges, they also dig tunnels and channels. I mean, they do a lot of digging. We'll talk about that in a bit. They have these giant webbed hind feet on a really big beaver. It's almost the size of your hand. And they use that for swimming. They'll just see them kicking along, and that's how they push themselves forward in sort of a slower, more methodical swim. And then the really big feature that everybody associates with beavers is the big, flat, scaly tail. And they can use this as a propeller. Well, I guess not really a propeller, because a propeller would spin, which would be really cool to see if beavers did do that. But they really just use it, you know, they're waving it in the water. They'll wave their whole body and they'll kick with that tail and with their feet, and they'll just do these really fast swimming motions. But it's also very flexible. It can move back and forth. It can curl a little bit, it can move up and down. So they use that as a maneuvering device or rudder as they're swimming around. But that's getting tough to see, huh? And then this tail is also a really important fat storage device. So if you catch a beaver right before winter when they should be at their most robust, that tail, like this one, will be nice and thick, and you won't see a lot of features in it. And then if you catch that same beaver in the spring after they've spent all winter just eating off of their food cache, it'll be really skinny, and you'll actually see the tailbone coming into the tail. That's cool. Okay, beavers are strictly herbivorous. Every once in a while I run into people that still think that beavers eat fish. They don't eat fish. They all only eat plant material. And so this is kind of the classic thing that most people are used to seeing when it comes to beaver impacts. And this is them trying to cut down a cottonwood. So of all this material they've removed, they've eaten very little of that. What they're trying to do is they're trying to knock that tree down so they can get to those hundreds or thousands of smaller branches that are up at the top of the tree that are more nutritious and easier for them to handle and work with. So you might see those big cuts out of the big trees, or oftentimes you'll just see a bunch of little stems, especially with willows, that are cut like this with that nice beveled 45-degree angle edge. And you can see the little tiny tooth marks running up it. And so beavers are not eating the entire stem. They're eating, so they're not eating this middle part. They're not eating the outside bark. They're eating this layer right here, which is called the cambium layer. That's basically the new bark that's growing to turn into what you see here. So that's the most nutritious part of the stick. And so what you'll do is you'll see them with these little stems, literally just like corn on the cob, just like You can hear it sometimes if you're near a lodge or something. And they're just removing all that cambium, and then you'll just see these all around the beaver colony, these deposited little sticks that have had the cambium layer removed. And if they're working on a big stick, they'll often just take that completely peeled stick and use that to help build their dam or lodge. Beavers are considered a choosy generalist, meaning that they will eat a huge range of plants, but in each area, there's specific species that they really focus in on. So for Western Montana and these mountainous areas, they need one of these 4 species around in order to occupy an area for a substantial amount of time, basically to overwinter somewhere. So aspen is like ice cream for beavers. And then there's cottonwood and willow, which is like their second preference. And then alder, they often can't survive strictly on alder. They'll need something else mixed in, but they definitely can eat alder. And the cool thing about a lot of these plants is that they will grow from almost anything. So if you clip a stem, you'll see this just sudden flush of growth from just below the clip. So the willow recovers really quickly, or the cottonwood. And then also if you move cut stems around and it lands in the right spot, it'll just re-sprout straight from that clipping. And you can actually see the adventitious root growth kind of coming out from those little nodes. So it's just kind of a cool thing. A lot of people think that once a beaver cuts something down, it's dead. And really that's not the case. And a lot of the regrowth of willows in beaver colonies comes from caches and dams and lodges where they've shoved all these sticks into mud. So the reason they need one of these 4 species out here in Western Montana, those are what we call woody riparian vegetation species. And in the summertime, beavers can eat whatever they want. They'll eat grass, they'll eat forbs, they'll eat tubers of cattails, things like that, aquatic vegetation. But in the winter, they become very restricted to just the pond and their main lodge, whatever lodge they're deciding to overwinter. And they need this woody vegetation because they build these big caches, which is just a giant raft of material. And so what happens is winter comes along, they've built up their cache, and then the top of their pond freezes. And any sticks that are sticking up above the main body of the cache get frozen in place, and that kind of anchors the cache. And then all winter long, the beavers are, I'm actually standing on a beaver lodge right here. They're going out from an underwater entrance in their lodge, swimming under the ice, grabbing sticks out of that cache and going back to the lodge. So they don't hibernate. They just enter this state of reduced activity where they just travel between the lodge and the cache, the lodge, a cache, lodge, a cache, eating that cache all winter long. And so if you come back at the end of the winter, this is what you'll find, which is just thousands of those stems that have had that cambium layer removed. So that woody riparian vegetation is a limiting factor for beavers in areas where their ponds freeze solid. There's some variation out in eastern Montana where they can survive on tubers all winter long, but for the most part, especially around here, they need one of those species so that they can make that winter food cache. So beavers are best known for their engineering capabilities, and this is really what's going to lead into our conversation about their ecological impacts and their impact on stream systems. And there's a lot of different forms of engineering that beavers do and ways that they affect this environment that they live in. But the one that people know them for the most probably are beaver dams. And that is really the main agent of change on the landscape when beavers move into an area. So the reasons that beavers build dams, the primary one is that they need deep water. They need deep water because they need to cover the entrances of their lodges so that if they dive underwater and get into the lodge, something can't just follow them right in there, a predator or something like that. So they need deep water to cover the entrances of their lodges. They also need deep water so that it doesn't freeze solid in the winter and freeze through their cache or freeze past the entrance of their lodge. So the deeper the water is, the less chance that it's just going to freeze solid. And finally, they build these dams so that they can flood a large area. And that gives them access to resources throughout a larger area. Because as long as they're close to water, they feel safe. When they have to travel over land to go cut down a cottonwood or clip some willows, that's when they're most vulnerable because they're slower on land and they don't have many defenses other than biting. So as long as they can stay close to water, they're pretty safe. So another impressive form of engineering they do are their lodges. So this is a very typical mound lodge. So this is just a dense amalgamation of sticks and mud and sometimes rocks and sometimes road signs and weird stuff that they find around the stream. And there's a hollow cavity in there and a nice dry platform. So as they are building up their dams and raising the water level wherever they are continually building these lodges, that platform in the lodge higher and higher, and excavating that chamber so that it basically just keeps getting bigger and bigger until they have everything they need. And a lot of lodges will actually start as just a hole in the bank. And then as the water level comes up, they dig up, they hit the top of the bank, and then they have to build a mountain lodge on top of it. And this is what those underwater entrances look like. So this is kind of a tunnel leading up to the main lodge part. And this is underwater entrance. So this is a drain pond. They almost always have multiple entrances. So there's another entrance over here. And then if we were able to walk across the other side, there was another entrance leading out to the main channel of the river there. And so again, just a nice stronghold for them to escape into. Beavers also have bank dens. Like I said, sometimes those end up becoming mound lodges. But for every one big, tall mound lodge in a colony, there's often like 5 to 10 bank dens that you wouldn't even know were there. They're almost always close to somewhere that they can escape to. When we were catching and radio marking beavers, we would catch them throughout the colony wherever we could find a good place to trick them. And then as soon as we released them, I mean, they would just beeline it to some little hole in the bank that we had no idea was there. And often the only time you can tell that these exist is you'll see this freshly excavated gravel, and sometimes you'll see those chewed up sticks right at the entrance of this bank there. And a lot of times they're associated with some sort of structure that slows the water near the bank if they don't have a big pond yet. And so the tunnels and the chambers that they excavate to create all these dens are extensive. And sometimes I would find radio mark beavers. I'd be standing like 50 feet away from the stream channel and the beaver was right below me. No sign of a lodge or anything, but they just have all of these tunnels and networks that really have not been thoroughly, like mapped or studied yet. We talked a little bit about the food caches. I did put them in the engineer part of this talk because these can end up being really major amalgamations of sticks. This one is probably, like 6 feet by 3 feet or something like that, a fairly small one, a newly established colony. But they can get to be things like this. So here I am standing on top of a giant boulder, looking down. This is a beaver lodge that's probably 6 or 7 feet across. And that's this gigantic cache that they made out of willows. And these things can get so big that there's plenty of caches that I've been able to just walk across the top of it without sinking down. Like they are huge. And they're not just placing these sticks in there. If you've seen underwater videos of beavers, they're taking a stick and they're like ramming it into the cache to like just really make it dense. And so if these caches go unused or they float downstream, they can actually be what you would call large wood in the stream in a way. Individual pieces may not be big, but the actual mass can be so large that it can form islands in the stream and it can change the way the water flows. A really quick story. This was an abandoned cache in a stream in Yellowstone National Park. And all that green on the cache are all willow resprouts. So all those willows are growing. And what ended up happening here is underwater, all those roots were going down to, help support this new growth. And that basically created like a big mesh web of root growth under there, which then just captured sediment and algae and stuff floating down the stream. And by the time I went back to this about 5 years later, unfortunately with no camera, this was just like, it just looked like a peninsula of land growing there. And there were these big tall willows coming out of it. And all that just because they made a cache and then ended up not using it. So the last form of engineering I want to mention are those tunnels and runways that we've kind of talked about. Beavers know their colonies really, really well, and they use the same pathways over and over and over again. And you'll end up with things like this, where they've just slowly shoved rocks off to the side, and they now have a little pathway they can walk through. But then there's those major tunnel systems I was talking about. There's dam crossover points that lots of other creatures will use. But one of the more extreme examples I've ever seen, this might be a little hard to see. So what I'm standing on right here is a sediment bed from a really, really old dam, like decades, maybe even a century old. That's just accumulated so much sediment that it's basically filled in. But the beavers have dug this channel over and over and over again to get back to this really old lodge back here. And that channel is just like straight-sided, straight down about 4 or 5 feet deep. And so those beavers, I mean, they're influencing how water is moving through this system for decades to come after they're gone, just because they dug this huge channel to keep getting back to that lodge. Okay, so believe it or not, that was all just part 1A of Beaver Basics. So the rest of them are a little bit quicker. So now we're talking about the family unit. So beavers live in family units, and a general family unit for beavers, a typical beaver colony will be male and female mated pair. Their kits, the little cute ones, yearlings from the previous year that'll still be at home. And then at about 2 years of age, beavers usually disperse from their natal colony and head off on their own. And that's generally. But if there aren't any good available territories nearby, if it's a high density of beavers, you can sometimes see 3, 4, 5, and 6-year-old beavers that are still at their natal colony because they just haven't had a chance to disperse yet. And in those situations, you can have beaver colonies that consist of like 8 to 15, 16 individual beavers, all living in the same colony, multiple generations, all helping build and repair dams, helping to raise the young ones, warn off predators, all those things. And it's actually a really interesting thing from an evolutionary standpoint because they are contributing to the overall lifetime inclusive fitness of their family, not necessarily themselves, which is kind of a cool thing. So that's your general beaver family unit. But like I said, at around 2 years of age is when beavers take off on their own. And most of that dispersal occurs during runoff. So don't try too hard to read everything on this graph. This is just December through February, just an annual time period. And this is the number of dispersal movements. So the bars are dispersal and settlement of radio-marked beavers. And then these graphs in the background are the annual discharge graphs for this area. This is really just to show that when runoff is happening is when beavers really just take off and they're moving all over the place. They're defending territories and it's kind of this chaotic time period. And I think it's just because there's so much water around, it's really easy to move. And those beavers can end up doing a lot of different things. So each one of these different colors is a different radio marked beaver. The lighter color is where they started. The darker color is where they ended. And you can see some of them had multiple movements. So green went to there and then ended up settling right there. So this is just to show that these dispersing beavers can do almost anything. Sometimes they'll just take over as a member of the breeding pair of an existing colony. They may move upstream and find an abandoned colony and just start from there. Or they may, move across the entire Hebgen Lake basin and end up in a completely different stream and try to start a colony from scratch. But really, within the same stream, within 2 years, the amount of variability in terms of dispersal outcomes is really quite astonishing. And what we found is that most of these beavers in this high density population dispersed and settled in what we consider an active colony. So there's a lot of like mate replacement going on where these dispersers are kicking out another member of an active colony or just taking advantage of a death or something like that. So if we take our family unit and we add all of those engineering feats, what we get is what I would call the beaver colony. So this is the territory that that family unit is defending and where they're repairing all their dams and lodges. But maybe the better term for a colony that better describes why they're doing all of this work, why they're spending so much time manipulating water and the habitat they live in, is because this is their fortress. When a family of beavers gets a really well-established colony, big strong dams, big strong lodges, lots of pathways everywhere, their survival rate goes way, way up. I mean, they are really well protected. Most beaver deaths happen from dispersal movements or from some sort of disturbance that blows out the dam and leaves them vulnerable. But once they get a really well-established colony, they are doing really well. So the question that comes up is, where does a colony come from? Why does it develop? So obviously you need at least one beaver. Usually it's 2 beavers, a mated pair that's linked up that start forming a colony. You need a section of stream that generally has less than 15% gradient. Usually it's like 1 to 6% gradient. It's like really ideal for beavers and where they can really take off. You need that woody riparian vegetation for the overwintering. You also need a stable water supply. So they don't do well in like intermittent or ephemeral streams. There's some situations where they can survive in those streams, but they need water that lasts throughout the year. They need about 400 meters, 400 yards-ish of stream, like measured along the stream, to have a dam, a lodge, and plenty of foraging area. So that would be a fairly small colony. I've seen single colonies that take up 2 kilometers of stream. Like they can get huge, but that's kind of the minimum. And then this is the really important part, which is that beavers need a riparian footprint to start with. There is a notion out there that if you get beavers into a stream, anywhere, they will create a wetland oasis out of nothing. And they're not good at doing that. What they are good at doing is taking a pretty good riparian area with, willows that go away from just right next to the stream channel, some form of channel complexity in side channels or backwaters, and a low-lying area that they can flood easily. And they can take that kind of place and enhance it and spread the edges of it up and downstream and use it as a stronghold to send dispersers out to other areas. So this is really what we look for in trying to restore beavers in an area, is where can they have a good chance to develop a long-term self-sustaining colony that can lead to the sorts of benefits that we may want from them that we're going to talk about in the next section. So I like to think of a riparian footprint as the canvas that beavers can paint on. Their paint being dams, channels, all this stuff that they can use to manipulate water and vegetation. So this is a pretty good example of one. And it's just a low-lying area with lots of woody riparian vegetation. So if the beavers were down here where it's kind of a canyon, they don't have much room to work with. Whereas out here, they can move this stream back and forth across this floodplain over time all they want. And for the most part, this regrowth of woody vegetation will keep up with any harvest or any depth from flooding. And the nice thing is you can see these riparian footprints pretty easily from aerial imagery. So this is just to show you about what 400 meters is. But like this up here, I would not call a riparian footprint. Very simple stream channel. The riparian vegetation is only right next to the stream. Whereas down here, you've got side channel, you've got big meanders, big wide section of woody riparian vegetation. That's a nice riparian footprint for beavers to get established in. And just to kind of show you some examples of these, they really show up well in aerial imagery because they're already low-lying, so you'll see a lot more green vegetation growth. And you can really see that riparian vegetation because it's generally pretty green. So just some examples of the types of places that beavers can do really well. And again, we're talking about the difference between beavers being able to survive in an area at all, like for 1 or 2 years, versus an area where they can get in there and form these really long-term colonies that create wetland complexes. So that's what leads to the start of a colony, things that can end a colony. If the dams keep blowing out, like a really strong stream that just blows the dams out over and over again, or a degraded stream channel, that'll cause them to move on either because they just get sick of building dams all the time or they run out of vegetation. Similarly, resource depletion is actually quite rare. Beavers very rarely eat themselves out of house and home, but there are situations where if they harvest a bunch of vegetation and then flood out the rest of it, and then those dams don't persist long enough to encourage vegetation growth on the outskirts of the colony, they can actually end up using up too much of that resource and then they have to move on. Another common one in areas where beavers are really successful is that the ponds or the stream channel will eventually just silt in so much that they can't get the water deep enough anymore. And that's actually what's happened in this pond down here. You can kind of see that you can see the bottom of the pond. It just filled in with sediment so much that the beavers, they can't excavate a channel anymore and they just have to move on. And in that situation, I just consider it like the beavers did their work. Great job. We love you. Go ahead and find another place to do it. Of course, any animal can be excavated from an area because of predation. That can be people trapping them. That could be mountain lions, which love beavers. Wolves, bears, coyotes, any of those sorts of things. There's also a very long list of diseases that beavers can get. The really bad one being tularemia. Is actually this colony, we had 6 radiomarked beavers, 5 of them died of tularemia, and we found 7 other beavers that were dead of it as well. So tularemia has been known to wipe out entire drainages worth of beavers. And we don't know much about it. We think it's probably when they get to high densities, it tends to crop up, but it's a pretty bad one in terms of knocking out beavers. And then finally, if there's some reason the water resources get lost, irrigation diversions, ongoing drought, something like that. So finally, looking at multiple colonies spread throughout a drainage, we're talking about the beaver population. So on these two maps that I'm going to show, in yellow are active beaver colonies. The beavers are there right now doing their work. Abandoned are red, these ones. That means there's still dams and lodges in place. If another beaver moved in, it would just have to do some repairs and have a colony ready to go. In black are relic colonies, meaning there used to be beavers there. You can still find old dam berms and lodges, but the stream is pretty much cut back through. If another beaver moved in, it would have to re-repair everything. And then purple is, or pink is unoccupied, but potentially suitable. Blue is no way is it suitable. It's like a canyon section or there's no woody riparian vegetation. So looking at this drainage, my first thought would be that this is a low density population of beavers. But without detailed knowledge of what's going on in these unoccupied sections, we really can't say it's a low or high density because the density of beavers always needs to be placed in the context of suitable habitat. So this is potentially suitable. We think it might be suitable, but there's obviously some reason the beavers aren't settling down in these pink sections. So because I have walked all the streams in this drainage and I do know about those pink sections, I can say with pretty good confidence that this is actually a fairly high density population of beavers. For most of the area within this drainage that has really good suitable habitat for the beavers, they're in there and they have a colony that's active. And one thing that's important to remember is territorial spacing as well. So if a colony is active here, there's going to be a buffer area where no other colony is going to be active, no matter how good the habitat is, because these beavers are not going to let them move in that close. So compare this drainage to these ones. We can see that there's a very big difference in the sort of colonization pattern of the beavers. And this is really just a reflection of the inherent characteristics of the stream itself. This is a very low gradient, slow moving, meandering stream with so much willow that they could never ever use it up. And so you can get these gigantic colonies and multiple colonies that almost seem to be linking together, large portions of the stream that are active. Meanwhile, just a few miles north in Grayling Creek, high gradient stream, lots of canyony sections, a little more limited in terms of those riparian footprints. And so you still do see lots of beaver colonies, but they're much more spread out and there's fewer opportunities. So both of these streams, I would say, have a high density of beavers. Both of them are closed for trapping. They both have lots of predators, but also lots of beavers. And so really looking at a beaver population it's always important to think about that context of where are they occupying the habitat in relation to the suitable habitat that's available for them. And another thing I want to point out is that a healthy beaver population does not mean that every potentially suitable habitat patch is occupied by beavers. A healthy beaver population includes these abandoned, relic, and unoccupied sections. And we call that a healthy beaver population because that is reflected in the overall health of the stream. If there's a balance here. If there's too many beavers, then you can have problems with tularemia outbreaks or overuse of their resources or warming of the water, things like that. Whereas if you have this sort of shifting mosaic of the different successional states of beaver colonies, that's when you get that habitat heterogeneity, that habitat diversity that we really want to see from beaver modified stream systems. And I will get into that a little more in this next section, which is part 2, ecological impacts of beavers. So I'm going to take a breather. Does anybody have questions about just beaver biology, ecology, right off the bat? Yes.
How large is a family unit?
So the smallest family unit I would consider would be a mated pair that haven't had any kits yet, or just a mated pair in their kits, like a newly established colony. The biggest family unit would probably be like 10 to 20 beavers if you're in that high density situation where there's lots of generations still sticking around. Yeah.
Are they fairly aggressive during that dispersal movement and kind of recolonizing other areas? Are they aggressive with each other?
Yes. So there's actually been some studies where they've looked at dispersal age beavers and they find a lot of bite marks out of their tail as an indication of how much aggression they've faced while they're dispersing. So if they end up in another colony, those existing beavers will like attack them full on. At the same time, if they are a dispersal age beaver, if they're a 5-year-old beaver that's been sticking around home for 5 years, getting big and getting experience, they may head off and bully other beavers completely out of their colony. So yeah, that dispersal period, there's a lot of aggression going on for sure. Yes.
Those maps were hand annotated, I imagine. Maps of the various streams and whether they're abandoned or relic.
Yeah, so underlying that is a bunch of data about beaver dams, beaver lodges that I marked with GPS unit and made notes on the state of them. Yeah.
Gotcha. Is there any interest in automating any of that mapping?
We will, yes, there is. I'll talk a little bit about that at the very end if we end up getting there.
Real quick, how do the colonies stay, their territory amongst each other? And I know they're in dispersal, there's going to be aggressions, they're not. But otherwise, what's their negotiation things with other colonies? Do they sit mark or do they bluff? Do they, how do they, like I say, keep separated pretty well?
Yeah, great question. So if you're walking along a stream and you'll get through a beaver colony, and then you'll all of a sudden see this section of stream that's like, 200, 400 meters or something like that, where it just seems like there's nothing going on, and you'll hit another beaver colony. And that's usually just kind of like this no man's land, and that's the territorial dispute area. And so what you'll see on the edges of colonies are scent mounds, which the beavers basically just pick up a bunch of mud and muck and sticks, push it up on the bank, and they'll use a castor gland, which comes out of their cloaca, to mark that scent mound with castor oil. And so that signifies to other beavers that this territory is occupied. We have active scent mounds out, stay away. And so if you're in one of those territorial dispute zones, you'll often see like dozens of castor mounds everywhere because there's two competing colonies, both signaling to each other, this is the edge of our territory, stay out. Yeah. Yeah.
So in those segmentation zones that kind of keep out beaver, does that silt eventually get pushed out of the system and then new beaver can come back and colonize that location?
That is a complicated question. I think I'll answer that in this part when I talk about sedimentation. For the most part, no. If it's a stable enough dam that it's gotten to the point that it's filled in with sediment. I mean, you can see like this dam here. That's not really vulnerable to blowing out as much anymore because it's completely overgrown with willows and it's like permanent berm on the landscape now. So generally, if a dam's around long enough to completely fill in with sediment, that sediment's going to be staying there for a long time. But like you saw in that one video, they will excavate sediment to keep it deep enough for themselves. But generally, you won't get like a complete restart without, like 100 years of succession. Is there any more? Okay. We're going to move on to my favorite subject. I know it may have maybe seemed like that one was my favorite subject, but this is actually my favorite subject, which is all this dam building that beavers do and cutting vegetation and manipulating water flow leads to really significant ecological impacts and hydrological impacts and geomorphological impacts and all this really cool stuff. Before we get into that, I just want to put into context the habitats we're talking about. This is kind of a typical picture of a Western Montana, Southwest Montana landscape. It's mostly dry, whether it's conifer forest, whether it's grassland, whether it's sagebrush. The vast majority, 95+% of our landscape is not riparian areas. But we just have all these little ribbons of green coursing through those big dry landscapes. And the overall health of all those ecosystems, of all those different habitat types, is directly linked to the health of these riparian areas. And that's not only because every species needs to drink at some point, a lot of species rely on green forage, especially late in the year when everything dries out, but also because depending on who you ask, 65 to 85% of the species in the state rely on riparian areas at some point in their life cycle. And of course, there's lots of species that are entirely dependent on them. So the health of these little ribbons of green is directly tied to the overall health of the landscape. And so any creature that can have a big impact on how these ribbons of green look, foreshadowing, is going to have a really big impact on the ecosystem overall. So I could fill this entire screen with bullet points of all the different impacts that beavers can have from all of their activities. And that's what I used to do when I give presentations about beavers, and I thought that it was just way too much. So I've tried to narrow it down to three big things, three big topics that I think basically cover all of it. And that is beavers' impact on sediment, primarily their ability to hold sediment in the floodplain in the stream channel and deposit it within the floodplain rather than having it zoom down the stream and on out to the rivers and lakes. Their subsequent impact on the way water moves across the landscape, primarily slowing it down a lot. And then the combination of capturing sediment and manipulating the way water moves across the landscape can lead to really diverse and wonderful fish and wildlife habitat. We're going to go through each one of these three, eventually ending up on my favorite subject, which is the impact of beavers on other species. My sub-favorite subject to the overall favorite subject. So unfortunately, a lot of streams in Western North America and a lot in Montana look a lot different than they did before European colonization. And what we did, the first thing we did is we came in and trapped out all the beavers. We removed those dams and those big woody debris from these streams. So already that was not good for our streams. The second thing we did is we moved in millions and millions of livestock into the Western rangelands. And we pushed streams off to the side of the floodplain, and we just took advantage of all this nice, wet, nutrient-rich soil in these valley bottoms for grazing ground. And this is before modern range management, where it was basically get your cows in there and graze the hell out of it before anybody else does. And so what has happened to thousands and thousands of miles of stream across the Western North America is that they have simplified, and a lot of them have gone through a process called channel incision. Basically what channel incision is the stream cuts itself down into its overall floodplain, to the point where even during the highest water flows, the water doesn't escape out of that channel and flow onto that larger floodplain. And so you end up with these very simplified stream channels that are basically glorified irrigation ditches. They just move water through the system quickly. They literally drain the landscape. Because that water level of that stream is so far down, water is just flowing in, getting caught in that channel, and it just zooms on out of there. So we have these incised stream channels, and they are very hard to recover on our own. In some situations, you actually need like a glacial event to reset that stream channel. But beavers can help us get out of this situation because this is what they do best. And that's where we'll start talking about sediment. So on the left side of the screen here is a big, long beaver dam. And you can see a massive amount of sediment that's built up behind that dam. So every time you see a muddy stream during runoff, spring runoff, or after a rainstorm, that is suspended organic matter and particulate matter, little pieces of wood, little pieces of minerals, whatever it might be. And as long as the stream is tumbling and moving quickly, that stuff just mostly stays suspended. It might, settle in some backwater somewhere or something like that, but it just keeps moving down the stream. When beavers get in the way, they slow that water down enough that that sediment will actually fall out of the water column and be deposited at the bottom of the pond. And as that sediment builds on top of itself, it pushes down the sediment below it, the weight of the water pushes that sediment down. And eventually this huge amount of sediment that's built up behind the dam can become basically a permanent feature of the floodplain, a semi-permanent feature of the floodplain. So if that dam degrades slowly enough, that sediment will stay behind and the stream will cut itself a new pathway through that sediment deposit. And because they've basically created like a low gradient section of stream by depositing all that sediment there, the stream will meander back through it rather than getting into that state of the flume, the single thread channel rushing through there. So looking back at a stream like this, and we'll actually shift to a aerial image view of this exact same stream. And this is very much what an incised channel classically looks like. It's stuck down in this trench. There's no side channels. There's no backwaters. The riparian vegetation in the floodplain area is just this tiny little strip right along the stream. So very simplified, very boring, and water just rushes. Water and sediment just rush right through it. So same stream, just a few miles downstream. And this is where beavers have been active. So we have a beaver dam here, this one here, this one here, big one here, and this big, long, sweeping one there. And so you can see these huge sediment deposits that have built up behind those dams. And because the beavers have built them in a series, they're backing up water from here to the base of the next dam. This one backs up water from here to the base of the next dam. And so that sediment deposit is spread across the entire big section of stream because of those multiple dams. So you can imagine that if beavers can get into these kind of incised systems and do this over and over and over and over and over again, up and down the stream, moving around over time, they can eventually fill that channel back in with sediment and lift that stream out and spread that water's influence back onto the larger floodplain. And that's how one of the ways that beavers can help recover these incised streams. Another way they can do it is a little more complicated. And I probably won't get into it here because it'll take way too long, but they can basically widen this inset floodplain to the point where natural sediment deposition occurs, and that raises the stream up in sort of the same fashion. And sorry for that very quick synopsis of that, but it's kind of weird. So same stream again, and you can see the problem with beavers trying to do this. This is their big beaver dam here. So even though they've done all this great work and backed up the water, A, they're still not getting out onto the floodplain, and B, they're quickly running out of riparian vegetation to work with. So they need that sediment pool, that deposited sediment, to be in place long enough so that when they have to leave, or they get trapped out, or they get eaten by wolves, that sediment will stay behind and the stream won't just cut straight back through it and go right back to where it was before. And so in situations like this with a heavily incised stream, sometimes humans have to go in and actually support these existing dams. We may have to build fake dams on the upstream and downstream side, all just to kind of smooth out that gradient of deposited sediment and allow it to stay there long enough for the stream to find its way back through it without just cutting straight back down. So compare this situation here, this beaver colony, this beaver dam on this stream, to one that is literally just over this ridge into the next drainage. Clearly this is not the same stream at all. This is a stream that has not incised woody riparian vegetation from one end of the valley bottom to the other. There's still beavers active in here. All these kind of dead willow spots and sediment deposits are all beaver dams. But here, the beavers can move this stream back and forth across the floodplain over time. So they may use up woody riparian vegetation here, and they'll create these little sediment deposits, but they can always move the stream back over here. They can, flood it over there. They can move upstream or downstream and wait for this to recover before they come back. But that stream has a lot more resilience to beaver activity than the one before. So long-term, what these sediment plumes turn into, or these sediment deposits, are what we call beaver meadows. So this right here, this big sweeping line, is a very, very old beaver dam that has basically become a permanent feature on the landscape. And this is the area that was their main pond and is now just a nice deposit of sediment that's nutrient rich and is clearly growing back quite nicely. And then this is kind of the edge of the pond. So the first thing I want to point out is that this stream has clearly cut back through in a very meandery pattern. It's not just a straight line through there. It has gone all the way to this end of the floodplain, and it goes all the way over there, and it comes all the way back. So it's pretty easy to imagine that now if a high flow comes through there, it's going to easily get out of that channel and spread across the floodplain to the benefit of all these great riparian plants. The other thing I want to point out is, yes, the beavers have removed a lot of willows from this area because they flooded it and created a sediment deposit. But all of this major willow growth here, and if I had more upstream, looks very similar upstream, is all related to the sort of sub-irrigation that the beavers have done by allowing the stream to connect to its floodplain. So you'll see these huge flushes of willow growth downstream of dams and just directly upstream of the ponds, whereas you'll get this kind of willowless area in the actual pond part. And so these impacts of beavers can last for centuries, maybe even millennia. So one more example here. This is kind of our cutoff zone. Downstream of here, historic heavy grazing impact, removal of beavers. You can see that simplified stream channel, very narrow riparian area. Upstream of there was protected from a lot of those impacts. And you can see these big wide parts that clearly have a lot of nice deciduous riparian vegetation, wetland type stuff. So we're going to zoom in on this one here. So this is clearly a nice oasis out in a dry landscape. There's going to be a lot of wildlife species that use this little patch of habitat. And what you'll notice here are these big striations coming across the floodplain. Here, even this one up here. And, you know, just upstream of those, there's kind of some shrubs missing, very much looking like the beaver meadow we just saw. And that's because that's exactly what that is. Those are super duper old beaver dam berms. And these beaver dams collected so much sediment and raised that stream up out of a channel so far, spread it out over that whole valley bottom, that what they left behind is this big, beautiful riparian area. And I'm not just making this up. I was out here on the ground first and then found it on aerial imagery. And so if you go out there, this is literally what you find. Each one of those striations is this big, long, old front of a beaver dam. And you can see upstream of it, it looks like someone just took a level and just like leveled it off along the lip of the dam. And that is just a remnant of all that sediment that built up and stayed there long enough that the beavers had to leave. And what they left behind is perfect conditions for, nice wet soils, really green vegetation, and a lot of plant and animal diversity. So thinking about all the sediment pouring off these hillsides during rain, snow events, if we can keep that sediment up in these headwater streams and build up those little ribbons of green, we can make them wider, we can make them stronger, more robust, and that is going to have a lot of influence on water movement. So this next slide, I'm going to overlay a picture on the left side, which is the same landscape, but in March. So this is March, this is July. They actually run seamlessly right into each other. And this is really just to emphasize how water works across most of Western North America, especially Western Montana. We get a certain amount of snow in the mountains every year. The timing and intensity of that snow melting and traveling through all these ribbons of green and on down to the big rivers and lakes really determines how bad our droughts will be and what sort of impacts we'll have not only to wildlife, fish and wildlife species, but also the humans and the water resources we need for agriculture, for drinking, all the things we use water for. So that march of the snow down through all these little rivulets out into the rivers and on out of the state is kind of the whole story when it comes to the amount of water we have in the state late in the year. So back to our big sediment deposit. If you were to go out there and reach down and grab a big old hunk of that muck, all that sediment that's deposited there, you could stand there and it would drip sediment or drip water for like, I don't know, 20 minutes, maybe something like that. That might be an exaggeration, but that's just to say that all that fine sediment really soaks up water and holds it well. And beaver colonies and beaver ponds are often called sponges on the landscape because they soak up the water and they hold it and they just cause it to move much slower. So the sediment itself is holding water, but it's also displacing water. It's again pushing the water out from that single thread channel and pushing it into other flow pathways through the floodplain. So that could be moving through groundwater. It could be a hyporheic flow exchange where the water actually goes down into old gravel sediments from the stream channel and then bubbles up downstream. It could be transient storage, which is when it goes out into kind of groundwater, shallow groundwater, and then just seeps slowly down and then comes back in the stream and then maybe goes out again. So all this is really just to say that by getting in the way of water, by depositing all this really dense sediment, the beavers are turning these streams from flumes where the water just zips on down into this sort of slow trickle. They're kind of holding that snowpack back and just like letting it come down slowly, and it just trickles through the environment rather than just rushing down it. So if water is moving through series of ponds like this, it might be moving quick in the channel up here and it slows down and spreads out. And then it gets quick again and it slows down and spreads out. And it gets quick again and it slows down. And that can lead to more water resources late in the year when we tend to go dry. And there are instances, plenty of instances out there where beavers have moved into an intermittent stream, one that goes dry late in the year. And the amount of slowing down of water they were able to do turned it into a perennial stream. And there's lots of other examples where they just, augmented an existing perennial flow. But you'll hear the term water storage used with beavers a lot, that they increase water storage on the landscape. I don't really like the term storage because that implies that they are holding it and keeping it for themselves. But really what they're doing is they're slowing the conveyance of water. They're just keeping that water from rushing out of the floodplain, basically. So again, this is a incised channel, very simplified, same area that we were looking at before, compared to an area with beaver activity, which basically spreads from down here all the way to the top of the stream. And pretty clearly, you can see that it's a lot greener around the edges of that area where the beavers are active. And that's just an indication that that floodplain is nice and soaked with water. If we zoom in on part of that, you can see some of the beaver dams here. Coming up there, you can see they're forcing overbank flow. They're filling up these side channels. They're creating backwaters. All of that is slowing down that water. And whew, I got talking too much, so we're going to skip past a little bit here. This is just the extremes of beaver colonization. These dams now stretch across the entire valley bottom, and that water is moving super, super slow. And that's what that looks like from the air. So really quick, some implications of that for wildfire. Many of you have maybe seen this shot from Joe Wheaton at Utah State University. Really severe wildfire went through. One of the only places that was left was where the beavers had raised the water table and created a nice soaked up sponge. This is an example that was sent to me from, I think, Gallatin Range by a guy named Clint Sestrich that works for the Forest Service. And this is an example of Hot Springs Creek over by the Madison River, where fast moving, really hot wildfire burned through this half of the meadow, but the one area where the beavers were active stayed green. So finally, I want to talk about beaver influences on wildlife habitat. So beavers are called a keystone species, which means that their presence in an area allows certain plant and animal species to exist where they may not otherwise occur. And beavers do this by creating different little ecological niches that a lot of different species can fill. So that could be creating still water bodies and disconnected floodplain pools. That could be changing the vegetation structure, all these different little effects that they can have. And so my favorite way to do this is to take a typical beaver colony. So the water is moving from left to right on the screen. There's beaver dams spread throughout here, not only creating big pools of slow moving water on the main channel, but also pushing all this water out onto the floodplain and creating all these disconnected pools. So what I'm going to do here is a whole bunch of this. I'm going to bring up a species. The arrows kind of point to some, maybe micro habitats that they might be using. So this is just to show at the scale of this beaver colony, all the different little ecological niches that different species can fill. So for bears really like to use riparian areas to move because it's a secure place where they can be hidden. And they usually flock to riparian areas. I shouldn't say flock. A lot of them move into riparian areas in the heat of summer because it's a nice cool place. They can find some green forage and maybe some prey items as well. So by expanding riparian areas, beavers can even benefit bears. Amphibians are probably one of the biggest beneficiaries of beavers in the entire state. And that's because to complete this complex life cycle that amphibians have, they need a lot of different little wetland types and different hydro periods, different temperature regimes. And so a beaver colony can provide all of those different little microhabitats in one small area. So they can be eggs and tadpoles out here in one of these little warm floodplain pools. And then as they metamorph and turn into adult frogs, they just move through these different wetland types until they're out on the main ponds and the main channel. Grouse, like rough grouse and sage grouse, really benefit from beaver habitats. And actually the recovery of beaver ponds out in the sagebrush steppe is one of the main routes that they're using to help recover sage grouse because it's such important brood rearing habitat. Elk and deer can find green forage around beaver ponds, even like when everything else is just crispy dry, they can still find green forage. And of course, moose love wetlands and lots of willows. Ducks can also complete their entire life cycle within beaver habitat. They tend to nest in the uplands and grasslands or shrublands. And then they need to move those vulnerable little ducklings on down into a nice secluded pool somewhere with lots of food and not many predators. And then when they're actually flying across the country on their migrations, these nice slow pockets of water can be really important stopover habitat. It's quite a few studies that have shown increased abundance and diversity of small mammals associated with beaver habitats, mostly because of that flourish of plant growth. By creating different types of vegetation structure through harvest and regeneration, it creates a lot more diverse habitats for different songbird species. Beavers can also come in and flood out conifers that are in the middle of the floodplain and create snags, which can be used by woodpeckers, bats and swallows, things like that. Great blue herons are really cool. They actually will, I have videos of them at the base of beaver dams, and they'll put out their wings and they'll herd fish like up to the edge of the beaver dam, and then they'll sit there and like pick them off as the fish try to figure out where to go. But every beaver colony has a token great blue heron or two. Otters, muskrats, and mink heavily tied to beaver habitats. The only place I've ever seen otters outside of a main river, like in tributary streams, is always associated with beaver habitat. And I actually have a pretty big sample size of that. That's not just totally anecdotal. I mean, it is, but you know. And then muskrats obviously need ponds. Bats, another big beneficiary, especially in dry habitats. Most bat species have to drink on the wing. So they need open, flat water where they could come in and get a good drink. And they also like to forage above open water where there's lots of insects emerging. So a lot of our bat species live in really dry areas. Beaver ponds might be the only open water available to them. And then those mud flats and wet meadows, flooded areas can be occupied by shorebirds, things like snipes, spotted sandpipers, soras. You may not find them on the landscape unless there's beavers there. Fish is a little bit of a tough one. There are benefits to fish in some situations, and there are drawbacks to fish in other situations. So because there are documented major benefits, I put them up here, but the picture is not necessarily as clear when it comes to fish, and it really depends on what stream you're in and what fish species you're dealing with. And then finally, macroinvertebrates. On a per stream length basis, beavers and beaver habitat tends to reduce the abundance, diversity, and biomass of invertebrates, macroinvertebrates. But because they make the flooded area, the wetted area of the stream wider, on a per floodplain length basis or a per valley bottom length basis, they will increase abundance and diversity and biomass of insects because there's so much more water around. But they're also introducing a whole different suite of species. So in a nice tumbling creek, rocky, highly oxygenated creek like Rattlesnake Creek, you'll get mayflies, stoneflies, caddisflies, those kind of fast-moving stream species. When you come in and get a nice silty bottom with still water, then you get dragonflies, damselflies, worms, midges, things like that. So you'll get different invertebrate communities as you move along the stream. So at a landscape scale, that's increased diversity of invertebrates. And I have gone a lot slower than my practice round. So we just hit an hour. So I'm going to move through this next part really quick. This is just saying that if you zoom out from just that patch scale, they're also creating habitat diversity at a landscape scale, because a huge part of the stream will have no wetlands, and then there'll be a wetland there. So at multiple spatial scales, they're creating this habitat diversity. Same thing here, turning a single thread tributary stream into a huge wetland complex. And that's the only thing that looks like that within about 10 air miles of this area. So any species that's dependent on that habitat type is only going to be in this huge area of the landscape because the beavers were there. And then I just wanted to talk about the temporal aspect. Beavers are called the rest rotation grazers of riparian systems. They move around over time, impact one area for a while, and then move on, impact another area. And all of that works to increase habitat heterogeneity, increase habitat diversity, and create conditions for a lot of different species. So I was just going to talk about some of the things we're seeing coming with climate change. Beavers can be a huge benefit in that regard, especially again in holding that snowpack that we do get back and allowing it to seep through the landscape much slower. And then this could be a whole nother talk. Be happy to come back if you want to talk about how we're actually using beavers as a tool to restore these degraded systems and to bring about a lot of those benefits we talked about. So that's moving beavers around, modifying the habitat so they can move in, or just mimic them, building fake beaver dams to try to get those benefits without them. So I don't think I can go into the Rattlesnake Creek part because I took too long. But I'd be happy to.
Has anybody not seen the Rattlesnake Dam? Or like the Beaver Dam up there? Can you just like give like a 5-minute, like,
So are they banking in there right now, or do we know what they are? Because I haven't seen any live there.
The beavers at,
Big underground stash at the new, the stock bridge.
yeah, so the dam at the Stockbridge, my interpretation of it is, I think what those beavers did is they emergency settled there. And the reason I think that is, A, they built one dam that so far hasn't held up really great. It looks like the water level has dropped quite a bit from being at the lip of the dam, which is usually where they want it in the winter. B, the cache they created is pretty haphazard and it's in the middle of a flowing part of the stream. And C, what you just said, which is that there wasn't a really well-developed lodge. Like they didn't create a big mountain lodge. I think they're living in a bank lodge. So what I think probably happened there is that those beavers were living somewhere else, maybe on the creek, maybe down in the Clark Fork, and they got disturbed late in the season. Whether that's, you know, someone was trying to trap them, whether a different dam blew out, their lodge got destroyed. And I think they found that spot and they were like, this will do for now. Let's settle here. Because if you look at the rest of Rattlesnake Creek and you see where beavers have established, there's a pretty clear pattern in terms of those riparian footprints that they're choosing. That spot at the Stockbridge doesn't really have those same features. And because Rattlesnake Creek is steep, high gradient, big substrate size, like big cobbles, main stem dams on that creek are generally not going to last through runoff. I mean, that is a huge creek when it comes to runoff. So most of the active beaver colonies you'll see, sorry, I'll just do this really quickly, are ones like this, where they're actually taking advantage of water that's coming out of a different drainage and hitting the Rattlesnake Creek floodplain where it's still flat. And they're maybe getting some water that's diverted off the main channel, but I couldn't find any long-term active colonies on Rattlesnake Creek that were completely associated with the main channel. So I think it just gets way too big. So I think that's what's happening at the Stockbridge. I will be really shocked if that dam lasts through runoff, and I'll be really shocked if they rebuild right there. I think what they're going to do is they're going to end up moving downstream and looking for another spot to settle down. But I have also made a lot of predictions about beavers in the past and been wrong. So I'm excited to see what happens there, and I'm glad a lot of people are paying attention to it. I got a lot of phone calls about that beaver dam, which warms my little heart because I love that people actually care enough to keep track of the beavers and what they're doing. So yeah, I'll be really excited to see what you all find out about that dam. So I'm sorry I went over and had to rush through that last part, but I'm happy to take questions, or if you need to get the heck out of here because you've been sitting for an hour, I certainly won't be offended by that at all.
real quick with the questions, can we, since we have folks on Zoom, can you just do a quick, repeat the question? If there's a question.
Oh, yes, sure.
Stephanie might have a couple
Yeah.
questions.
And I will put my contact information on here. This is the one picture I got of that dam at Rattlesnake Creek. I should have gotten more because I knew I was doing a presentation on it, but I didn't. I love talking about beavers, if you haven't noticed that. So always feel free to email or call me if you want to talk about anything beaver related, and I will probably move everything else that I'm working on and respond to whatever you ask me. So, thank you for having me. Yes.
One question, I have a friend that lives on Rock Creek and they just bought property and the neighbors have resident beaver families. And they're falling a lot of cottonwoods. And the neighbors are kind of worried about it. So they technically don't really want the beavers there.
Yeah.
What would you do as a landowner? What do you suggest as a landowner, what you do about that? You contact, I mean, eventually she was like, how do we get these beavers rehomed?
Yeah. So a lot of people want to rehome beavers. We don't do that very widely in the state for many reasons that I can talk about if you want to. But there are a lot of techniques. A big part of beaver restoration writ large, the umbrella term beaver restoration that includes a lot of things, is non-lethal conflict resolution. And so if people like me want more beavers on the landscape, there's going to be more conflicts with beavers, flooding roads, cutting down trees, whatever it might be. So there are a lot of really good techniques out there for dealing with beavers doing bad stuff. The Clark Fork Coalition here in town has hired Alyssa Chott for the past 3 years as a beaver conflict resolution technician. She's been introducing these techniques all over Western Montana, and she's awesome at it. So you can always get a hold of Clark Fork Coalition. I think she starts working again in May. She works like May through October. But for that specific thing, you can actually fence trees. just with some fairly cheap fencing. You put it around the edge away from the actual tree trunk so they don't climb the fence and cut above it. And that's really effective at getting them to stop cutting down trees. There's also a sand paint mixture that some people have used. Some people are now saying it's toxic. But for the most part, I mean, I get dozens and dozens of beaver calls every year with people that are pissed off about what the beavers are doing. And the primary thing that I tell them is that if you want to live along a river or a stream, you should expect river and stream critters to be there. And beavers knocking down cottonwoods is one of the best things they do for our streams and our rivers. That large woody debris that you were actually up there counting because we care that much about it, they create a lot of that. If you look at a typical log jam on the Bitterroot and just look at the base of all those trees and see how many of them were cut down by beavers, it's really pretty amazing. So that's a very important part of a healthy stream channel, is having cottonwoods fall into it. So I usually start with that conversation before moving on to here's how you fence them out, those sorts of things. But you can trap those beavers out during the regular trapping season. You can't get a damage permit just because they're cutting down trees. The only way you can get a damage permit is if they're interfering with irrigation infrastructure. So if they're thinking that they can trap or move those beavers out just because they're cutting down trees, they're not going to be able to unless they wait till trapping season.
I've got a question on the Zoom here. So Robbie is wondering, he's often heard what sounds like a bowling ball being tossed into the water late at night. Is that beaver's tails hitting the water or something else?
Yeah, so one other thing that big flat scaly tail does is they use it as a warning system and a way to startle predators. So what they'll do is they'll basically dive, and then as they're diving, they bring that tail down, they slap it on the top of the water as hard as they can. And if you've never had that happen to you at night on a river when you didn't know a beaver was nearby, it's so scary. I have been almost scared out of my boots a couple of times for beavers doing that to me. But it's basically just a warning system. It tells the other beavers around that there's something worth looking out for, and it just lets the predator know, like, you're caught. We know you're there. So, yeah, great question. Yes.
Going back to the kind of the conflict resolution stuff, is there any work that's being done on, say you have a stand of trees and beavers get introduced to the area, how that kind of the mass balance equation evolves over time? Like when they initially come, they got to knock down a whole bunch of things to make your dam, but then 10 years out, you should see it looking the same way. Something that affect modeling kind of how it evolves over time.
Yeah, that's a good question. So the question was, like, try to repeat it. What is the balance between beavers moving in an area and cutting down vegetation to like get their infrastructure developed, and sort of the long-term trend of that area? So yeah, it depends on the system. But for the most part, if they can cut down a bunch of vegetation, build up big dams and lodges and get that infrastructure in place, and then that infrastructure is fairly stable, meaning the dams aren't getting blown out every year, or the lodges aren't getting destroyed by high water, then they sort of enter into a state where they're just harvesting vegetation for food and for minor repairs. And so in that situation, a lot of time by sub-irrigating all that land around it and by moving all those clippings around, you'll see a big flourish of woody vegetation growth. And that will tend to keep up with the amount that they're harvesting. And in most cases, it'll completely outpace it. Now, there are situations that I kind of alluded to where if they're having to cut down so much vegetation to rebuild dams over and over again, then that regrowth can end up not keeping up with them, and they can end up depleting the resource over time. Now with cottonwoods, it's a little bit tougher because they'll knock down a 100-year-old cottonwood, and then you're gonna have to wait 100 years for a new cottonwood to be there, which is kind of hard thing to communicate to people sometimes. But you know, cottonwoods falling down is what cottonwoods do. They're as valuable to the environment knocked down and dead as they are living, maybe even more so. So I always tell people you're gonna see changes, and it's not gonna look the way you wanted it or you got used to it looking, but that's what rivers and streams do. They change all the time, and that's what keeps them healthy. A static stream is, to me, is like a dead stream, basically. Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Another one on the Zoom here. So Alex is wondering, what advice do you have for the minimum length of a reach to implement beaver dam analogs, and what sort of on-the-ground data should you collect before doing one of those sorts of projects?
Oh boy. Okay. So That depends very much on the stream, the type of stream you're in, the available area over which you could build BDAs, the state of the existing beaver colony and how you expect them to react to the beaver dam analogs. And probably something else that I'm forgetting. So I generally, and I should say BDAs are beaver dam analogs. They're fake beaver dams that people build to try to mimic beaver activity. So generally, I would say try to mimic what beavers do in real life. So if beavers need, like I said, a minimum of about 400 meters of stream to have a viable colony, that might be a good treatment reach. But if your 400 meters of stream that you want to treat with BDAs is flanked on the downstream and upstream side by a horribly incised, awful channel, it's going to be really hard to recover just that 400 meters of stream, because that stream is going to want to reconnect on the upstream and downstream end to that incised part. So that's why it kind of depends on where you're at and what the overall context of the stream is. But important things to look for ahead of time are going to be the level of incision. How big of BDAs are you going to have to build to get the water connected to that larger floodplain? And the stream gradient, so how many BDAs you're going to have to build to make sure that the water that's backed up from one BDA hits the bottom of the next BDA, and then that BDA backs up water that hits the base of the next one, so that you get that kind of smoothed out gradient. You're going to want to see how much riparian vegetation you have available. If beavers do move in, are they going to be able to, if they move in and repair your BDA, are they going to flood out all the woody riparian vegetation available? Oh man, that's a tough one off the top of the head. But yeah, basically I always emphasize to people, understand the context of your spot in terms of the overall beaver population in the area. Because if you build dams in a spot that has enough vegetation, the beavers are probably going to move in. That may be what you want, but if it is a pretty degraded channel with not much vegetation that goes away from the actual stream channel itself, it might be tough to have beavers there. So I guess my short cop-out answer is it depends on a lot of things. Yes.
How many successful projects have there been establishing BDAs and then having beaver recolonization in the area? I know that the pilot project on Birch Creek, Oregon was successful, or has there been any success in projects in Montana?
I would say that the BDA projects in Montana are not well tracked for the most part. A lot of the really successful ones have been done in really small streams where the BDA is going to last a long time, and not necessarily the types of areas you would expect beavers to move back into. So in Montana, I can think of, I think there was one on Blacktail Creek near Butte where they had beavers move in and take over the BDAs. Trying to remember all the BDA projects in Montana. There's a lot that I don't hear about as well. But most of the time it's those projects like Birch Creek or Bridge. Did you say Birch or Bridge?
Birch Creek.
Bridge
Yeah.
Creek. Yeah, where they definitely understood where the beavers were at in the drainage and what their potential habitat patches were. And then they built so many BDAs that those beavers had a choice of wherever they wanted to settle down. So unfortunately, I think a lot of BDAs are chosen to try to address severely degraded streams to the point where beavers are not going to be there for a really long time. And there's a lot of input in the BDAs necessary to get the stream to the point where beavers can move in. And a lot of time that level of input is not being incorporated into the project. So it'll be maybe a one-time treatment, and then go back a few years later to repair them. But in terms of entirely recovering that stream like an existing beaver population would, I don't think those projects are occurring quite often enough. So we have done a project out at Spotted Dog Wildlife Management Area where we're putting in, they're kind of like BDAs, but they're more like check dams with a BDA on top of them. And we've had really great success getting that beaver population in there to, at least in one spot, to really respond to those structures and to this channel plug we put in that basically diverted the water out of the incised channel and back onto the floodplain. So the type of BDA projects that I get really excited about are ones where it starts with, we know beavers are here, we think they can move into this area if we just prop them up a little bit, give them a little support with BDAs. I think that's where we can get a lot of return on the investment in terms of BDAs if it's from the get-go acknowledging the existing beaver population and trying to work with them to move them into areas of kind of like suboptimal and marginal habitats.
And so those are probably the most, I guess, like suitable habitats for beaver relocation as well, though. I'm just thinking like if you trap a beaver in some urban area or it's causing problems to some people somewhere and then you're moving it, how do you know without like having ground truthing data where the best place to relocate that beaver would be?
Right. I would say don't try to move beavers unless you've ground truthed where to drop them off at. So in order to move beavers in the state, you have to do an environmental assessment, it has to go for public comments and get approved by the Fish and Wildlife Commission. So in that process, you have to identify where you're going to get the beavers from, and you have to very much lay out the spot you're going to release them and why you think it's going to be successful. And even the very best beaver reintroduction projects across the United States, their best success rate is like 60% of the beavers stay put. So almost no matter what, you're going to have to do multiple releases. And even then, you're probably going to expect those beavers to either move on or get killed. The way to ensure better success is to do like what they did the Methow Valley Beaver Project over in Washington, which is build BDAs, build fake lodges, and basically give them a fake abandoned colony to move into. So when we had all those radio marked beavers tagged, I mean, they would take an old abandoned colony over a unoccupied or unmodified section of stream almost every single time. Almost none of those beavers started from scratch. They all just moved into areas that other beavers had already manipulated at some point. And so if you can kind of mimic that process, you have a lot better chance of released beavers staying put, I think. Yeah.
That also suggests it's density dependent though, right? So if you release the beavers into an already dense area, there weren't any abandoned colonies, and they might be forced to build another one.
Yeah.
Provided there was suitable habitat.
Right. And that's where there's this kind of threshold of like, is it suitable enough that they can be successful there, but not so suitable that you would have expected beavers from that high density population to have already taken it over. So if you're in an area with high density beavers and you see an unoccupied section of stream, you better really be asking yourself, why haven't all those dispersers that must exist and all those other colonies, why haven't they occupied that yet? And hopefully the answer may be they just need a little bit of support with BDAs, or even doing like what they did in Bridge Creek, where they went in and reinforced existing dams so that they wouldn't blow out during runoff. And that got those beavers over that threshold where they're building dams, they get blown out, they build a dam, it gets blown out. It kind of gets them past that point where these dams can survive multiple runoff cycles. So yeah, a high density beaver population is nice because you know that if there's unoccupied habitat, something's up that's keeping them from occupying that. And usually if you go into those areas, you can see where they've tried to dam it a couple times or something and it's just blowing out or things like that. So yeah, that's a very good point. This might be the most in-depth beaver questions I've ever faced.
So Deb is wondering on the Zoom here, what sort of efforts are there to help people learn more about the importance of beavers and living with them?
What kind of what?
What sort of like education efforts are there to help people learn more about beavers, how to live with them?
Oh boy, there's lots of good ones out there. So in terms of living with beavers, FWP has a Living with Beavers page that has been recently updated. That's really good, outlines a lot of the different conflict management techniques. Same with Clark Fork Coalition, their webpage also has a section on living with beavers. Probably the best website on the internet for kind of comprehensive resources on that is the Beaver Institute at beaverinstitute.org. That's actually a nonprofit, and he has a for-profit wing of it as well, where he professionally trains people to use these non-lethal conflict mitigation techniques. So Alyssa Child, Clark Fork Coalition, was trained by the Beaver Institute. If you want to learn more about beaver restoration, I highly recommend the Beaver Restoration Guidebook. If you Google the Beaver Restoration Guidebook, you'll get to that. Really great thing to just learn about beavers generally. They have a whole intro section where you can learn everything you want to know about beavers. And then they go into conflict resolution, they go into beaver dam analogs, they go into other forms of beaver restoration. So this is a really great comprehensive guidebook. And I actually think it's a nice read just by itself. It's not overly technical and complicated. Yeah, I'll leave it at that. Those are probably the best ones out there. Really great books. Eager by Ben Goldfarb, great beaver book. The Beaver, Its Life and Impact by Jeetland Muller-Schwartz is another really good one. And Ellen Wool just came out with a beaver book that's really, really good too, called Saving the Damned, I think it's called. Why We Need Beaver Modified Ecosystems. Yeah.
Has the beaver population in Montana responded or rebounded fully since the height of the trapping days, or not really?
No, and the main reason being, it's not that we've kept up that level of trapping or anything like that. It's probably not due to predator populations. It's just that when we removed all those beavers and then overgrazed those systems, they changed to a completely different state. And recovering those back to the point where beavers can widely occupy them is a monumental task. And in some areas, it's just not going to happen until there's another glaciation event. So like that stream I showed, that single thread channel, I mean, there's thousands of miles like that. And the beavers are already struggling just to recover that one. So, estimates are like 400 million beavers before the fur trade, and now we're up to maybe back up to maybe 10 million. So we're still at a fraction of their former glory, but there's also huge sections of stream that will never be suitable again for beavers. So they are recovering nicely. I find them in most areas I look for them that should have suitable habitat, but the amount of suitable habitat has just plummeted since that huge impact of the removal of beavers followed by the grazing. Yeah.
Could you talk real briefly about river and large body water beavers? I mean, you see that too. You go to sometimes a mountain lake or an area that's an inlet, I've seen beaver lodges or, the beaver here in our Clarksburg River too.
Yeah.
Or do they kind of have this dispersing move about action going on too? Then for food rights, they just go out a little further, or just make a lot of fake catches.
Yeah. So the question was, what about beavers in our big streams, lakes, wetland systems that aren't these small streams where they have to build dams? And there are a lot of beavers in our main rivers. It's a stronghold for beavers in the state, I would say. And basically they're the same as the beavers that build dams. They just don't have to build dams because they have a big body of water that they can use. So they're still eating the same stuff. They're still doing most of the same things, but they live in bank dens. Sometimes you'll find mound lodges along the Bitterroot even, or the Clark Fork. And they're still knocking down cottonwoods. They're still up on the bank eating willows. They'll build caches. They'll just kind of push them right into the bank or hide them in amongst a log jam or something like that. So they don't have as dramatic of an impact because they're not building dams, but they still are an agent for dropping cottonwoods in the river and for creating, banks that aren't just one, long, simple bank. There's coves that are dug out of them. There's tunnels and things like that. So they still do have a really big impact on rivers and lakes, but it's not as dramatic as completely changing the way the stream and floodplain look. As far as dispersal, I don't know much about dispersal, but I imagine it's fairly similar. They're still defending territories along the river. They're still scent mounds along the river too. There's a little bit harder to define because you don't have those easy dam structures to say, this is clearly the extent of this colony.
Could you touch really briefly on the effects of climate change and beavers and their habitats?
The effects of climate change on beavers and their habitats. Briefly. Well, beavers, for many reasons, can be a good climate adaptation strategy. So if we're looking at lower runoff or lower amounts of snowpack, faster, flashier, earlier runoff, again, them holding that water on the landscape longer, allowing it to seep out slowly, can be a good way to sort of mitigate some of the impacts of drought and of less snowpack. In terms of how it affects beavers themselves, the main thing will be loss of perennial flow in streams that are kind of on the edge right now. So if beavers can get into those systems and build these big wetland complexes, they may be able to maintain that perennial flow, or at least long flow throughout the year. But if that flow runs out before they ever get there, then there's no reason they're going to try to colonize that spot. We're also seeing the potential for climate change to cause introduction of really bad non-native species. The one that we're really worried about is tamarisk and Russian olive. So we don't have to worry about that too much around here yet, but if it gets hotter and drier and warmer, there are places in eastern Montana where the beavers will go in and cut out the cottonwoods. They're replaced by Russian olive, and you really don't get those cottonwoods back. So invasive species is another one. Same with warming water temperatures. There are lots of situations where beavers will warm water. And if we're looking at things like bull trout and cutthroat trout that need cold water, there may be lots of systems we just can't have beavers in, because if they warm that water a few degrees, or over long stretches, they're continually warming the water in patches, that can have bad effects on those species that need cold water. So that's probably the briefest overview I can get. Anything that affects water is going to affect beavers. Yeah.
I'm also curious about the effects of wildfire on sedimentation in beaver complexes. So has there been any research on, or do you know about, like, to the extent that wildfire or like sediment runoff due to wildfire affects beaver ponds and the sedimentation rate that fills it up?
Yeah, I don't know of any published research on that, but I think kind of logically we can, oh, sorry, the question was, how does wildfire in the uplands potentially affect sedimentation rates of sediment coming down in the stream channel and getting caught behind beaver dams? So anecdotally, I have seen areas where a basin burns and then there's still beavers in there, and those ponds silt in like the next year. Like that, all that sediment coming out the hillside will just completely fill it in 1 year. And I believe there's actually places where they're taking advantage of that, and they're going in post wildfire. And I think this has happened even before the beaver revolution, where they would build sort of check dams or fake beaver dams to just capture that sediment and hold it in the floodplain rather than have it rush down into streams. So if you're ever up in the Fish Creek drainage and you go up Deer Creek, there's a really cool example of this up there, and you can look at it on aerial imagery in Google Earth and kind of click through the various years. But huge wildfire went through there, and then beavers came in fairly quickly afterwards, because if you remove the conifer overstory, what comes back is beaver food most of the time. So wildfires can actually create areas that beavers can move back into because it removes that conifer overstory. But it happened in Deer Creek. They came in and they built dams, and you can see it on aerial imagery. They build a dam. The next year, that dam is completely filled in with sediment, and they moved downstream. They built another dam. That one fills with sediment. You can kind of see them trying to like deal with that. I think that's what I'm seeing on that aerial imagery. But certainly anytime you have a lot of sediment coming off the hillsides, it's going to very quickly get captured behind those dams. For better or worse, that may cause the beavers to leave entirely, or it just may mean that they have to move around the stream a lot more. But certainly that flush of deciduous vegetation growth afterwards can allow beavers to move back into areas. And that's another reason, going back to your question over here, in terms of how beavers look compared to pre-European colonization. A lot of because of fire suppression, a lot of these headwater streams are now completely choked with conifers, and they've lost that disturbance regime that brings in that flush of deciduous vegetation that beavers could use. So beavers can't move into a lot of headwater streams simply because there isn't any food for them because of that dense conifer overstory.
Guys,